Okay, so I
Well,
am
like we
recording as of
forget
now.
stuff. So,
Yeah,
okay, thank
I'm
you.
recording, and what I'll do is, if it's a really good recording, and you all consent afterwards, I'll make it public. But I will make this recording available to anyone who contacts me afterwards via Zoom, as long as they let me
Perfect.
store it on there, and then you can watch it back, sped up. So this is an introduction to Bitcoin course. It's not a very advanced course. My first two slides will explain what is and isn't in this course. So it's not going to be everything, but it is hopefully a good introduction for you all. If you do have a question and you feel it's pressing at the time of what I'm saying, many questions will get answered later in the presentation. But if you have an urgent one, feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me and ask the question. Don't try waving your hands or anything, because as I present, I can really only see myself typically. So I do ask that you feel free to interject with a question. I'll do my best to answer it. I won't, if I don't answer it, then it'll either be because it's out of the scope of what's in the course, or it gets answered later on in the course. So let's begin. I've actually got 2 hours personally set aside. I've only mentioned that you need 90 minutes. Usually this course takes only about 70 minutes to deliver, and there's at least 20 minutes of Q&A, but there's often people who want to hang back and ask more questions. So let me get started. So first of all, what is this course? It is just introductory material. Bitcoin is a very deep topic. I've been studying it for 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, maybe even. I still don't understand it all. Nobody understands it all. So we're only going to do 90 minutes of education here. This is a non-technological and a non-mathematical explanation of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is computers. Bitcoin is math. Bitcoin is money. It's politics. It's a lot of things. We're not going to really go into the details of the technology or the math behind it. We'll maybe talk about a few things that in conceptual terms, but we won't do it. There is no math required. This is also going to be a basic comparison of Bitcoin to other monies. And the two most famous monies and the two most used monies are government money, like the US dollar, the Canadian dollar for people, or I don't know what or the euro for, for our European friends, and the pound. And also gold. Gold used to be money, and many people still consider it a money in some way. So we'll compare Bitcoin to those two things. And we'll talk a little bit about what Bitcoin is good for, particularly for individuals. Although I know that we have a couple of businesses here, Mark, so we may talk very briefly, or maybe at the later Q&A, there's no specific slides about how businesses can use Bitcoin as well. And there's also a very basic introduction on how to buy and hold some Bitcoin for people who are interested enough to be curious about what the next steps are if you're new to Bitcoin. And it's certainly also, I want to open it, it's an invitation to continue talking after the course. As many of you here were invited by Mark. He and I continue to talk, and we have lots of places to continue to communicate. And there's lots of hours in the day and a long journey down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, if you will, if you want to continue talking later. So you don't have to worry about having to answer every question, and you're going to wake up in the middle of the night with other questions. There's still lots of opportunities to get them answered later on. But this course isn't everything, and I want to be clear about what this course also is not. It's not a detailed explanation of how Bitcoin works. That's really complicated. There's lots of different moving parts inside of Bitcoin, and they all fit together really in interesting ways. But we're not going to go into that because it is very technical and sophisticated. It's also not a discussion of every single argument in favor of or against Bitcoin. You will have heard many objections or many praises of it. We can answer some of them superficially here, but there's hundreds and hundreds of arguments in favor of and potentially against Bitcoin as well. And so I can do my best, but I can't address the entire litany of everything that's ever been alleged. It's also not a discussion of all of the latest developments in Bitcoin or emerging issues. There's news every hour about Bitcoin, and we could spend 90 minutes just doing a news report on what happened today. So we're not going to do that though. It's not a detailed explanation of how to safely store Bitcoin. If you're buying Bitcoin and you want to know how to safely store it, that's something we can follow up on, and lots of different ways to research it. I'm by no means an only source on this, but you're not going to learn all that today here. And it's not a discussion about any of these other crypto assets. I will mention one or two things about these other things briefly, but today's about Bitcoin. And it's the first of these things, and I think it's really the only legitimate and valid one. I may explain why I think that is to you, but that's what that is. I see something in the chat here. Yeah, how to store Bitcoin is its own course. Somebody points out. Yeah, and it's not a lengthy Q&A about any topic related to Bitcoin. So we just don't have enough time to do everything and anything and everything. Let me give you a brief introduction about myself before we dive into the course material, just so you know who I am and my background. So I learned about Bitcoin in 2013. I mean, I could give you a little bit more about me, but only if you ask, because we don't have time. I fell down what's called the Bitcoin rabbit hole, which is just this endless study of Bitcoin. I've been studying nonstop ever since. So I'm coming up on 8 years of nonstop thinking and talking about Bitcoin and obsessing about it. I've been very active in the community. Back in 2017, Bitcoin went through a very tumultuous time. There was what was called the fork wars, and I was very involved in that. I wrote lots of essays arguing in favor of one side of what happened there. I became a moderator of Reddit's r/Bitcoin community, which is the largest Bitcoin community in the world. It's got several million members. I'm co-host along with with Bitcoin Mechanic, who's on this call here, of a podcast called For the Love of Bitcoin. And I'm authoring a series of articles on Bitcoin called Why Bitcoin, which I put in the chat. If you joined later and you don't see it in the chat, ask me to share it again at the end of when we go into the Q&A, and I'll share it. There are 15 articles so far, but I'm continuing to add to the series every few days with short articles that are accessible to newcomers and also interesting to long timers about Bitcoin. I will say this: I am a very big believer in the value and the society changing potential of Bitcoin. So you're being spoken to by someone who is a huge believer in this and very committed to it. And so you'll take that for what it is. And like so many people in the movement, I'm doing this, teaching these courses, sharing my time, writing the articles out of my love for Bitcoin and the ideas and ideals that it stands for and that it promises to make real in our civilization. So this is more than just a little investment. It's not like you've joined here and I've got a company I'm trying to push on you and telling you why it's a good company. This is a movement. And it's also an investment. It's also a lot of other things. And so we'll cover all of those things in this conversation. So let's begin. This course is in 3 parts. The first part is called What is Bitcoin? I'll occasionally share a graphic or two here. This is a tweet that I made back in December of last year. At the time, Bitcoin was worth, all the Bitcoins outstanding were worth $353 billion. So today they're worth over $1 trillion. And I pointed out Bitcoin has, the number of employees are 0. There is no CEO. It has never spent $1 on marketing. It has no marketing budget. Its hours of operation are always running. It's never down. Its locations are everywhere in the world. It's incorporated under the laws of nobody. Its code, the programming is the law. And the conclusion is, it's not like anything you've ever seen before. So I guess I want to prepare you for Bitcoin's different than anything else you've ever seen before. It's similar in some ways to some companies, but it's not a company. It's similar to a public good, but it's not public. It's unlike anything you've ever seen before. So we're going to try to wrap our heads around some of these things that Bitcoin is and isn't. So what the heck is Bitcoin? Let's start with a bit of a definition. It is a digital non-government money. So it's not a money that you can touch. It's not a physical coin. It doesn't exist tangibly. It's digital, and it's not issued by any government. It's not the first time a non-government digital money has been issued, but it is the first time that the idea has been launched in a manner that can survive. There were people who launched digital monies before, but in every one of those instances, those digital money projects got shut down, usually by the government, not necessarily as a result of the business going out of business, but because it got shut down by the government. And in many of those cases, the people running those operations ended up in jail because the government doesn't like other people making money. So producing money, they don't mind it if you make money. Bitcoin is not a company though. There's no headquarters, there's no head office, there's no employees, there's no people who work for it. It's code, it's code that runs. It is a consensus agreement, and that means that everybody who runs it runs the same rules and really can't change the rules. So it's an agreement by everyone who participates in Bitcoin. And if you end up running Bitcoin software or owning Bitcoin, you will be participating in these rules, both obeying them and enforcing them. And it's an agreement by all participants to obey a set of rules. And I kind of call it, as a result, it's like a little civilization within our civilization. And I'll explain a little bit as to why nobody can break these rules. It's some of you may already be thinking, well, what if I choose not to obey the rules? So I'll tell you why you actually can't not obey its rules. It utilizes computer code and cryptographic functions. You don't have to worry yourself about what cryptographic functions are too much here, but it uses computer code and mathematical functions to ensure that the rules are enforced, as opposed to relying on police or the courts. So unlike with our laws today, if somebody breaks the law, you accuse them, the police come and arrest them, you go to court, you try to prove that they did or didn't break the law. You can't break the rules in Bitcoin. They're enforced by these mathematical things. So we don't have to rely on police and courts to enforce the rules. We rely on the laws of physics and the laws of mathematics to enforce the rules of Bitcoin. And it operates in a completely decentralized manner. And by decentralized, we mean it has no center. It has no head. It has no heart. It has no location of its brain. No one is in charge. It has rules, not rulers. Nobody can change the rules of Bitcoin. And as long as everyone is running Bitcoin, it remains operational, or as long as anyone, is running Bitcoin, it remains operational and its rules cannot be broken. So I have, in my series of articles, I have different articles that cover some of these things. Like there's one article called Why Nobody Can Stop Bitcoin. That kind of addresses how hard it is to actually stop Bitcoin from operating because it's so decentralized. And I have another one called Why Bitcoin's Rules Are Enforced by the Laws of Physics, which kind of talks to how its rules are enforced. And the rules are actually a very limited set. It's not like, if you were to try to even read one law in the set of laws that are published by our government, it would take you forever to read it, and you might not understand it, and there would be ambiguity, and you might need a lawyer to help you understand what it means. The rules that govern how Bitcoin works are very simple. They govern only how Bitcoins can be created, how they come into existence, and how they can be spent. And since all it's doing is talking about how these tokens can be created and spent, that's what a money is. And so that's why it's a digital form of money. So that's kind of what Bitcoin is. You may find yourself confused at this point. Don't give up yet. It's like I said, it's not like anything you've ever seen before. And I'm going to take you in through it slowly as to what it is. So let's talk about what its basic rules are. They're very simple rules. One is coins can only be spent by people who can prove that they own them. And I'll explain how you prove that you own a coin, but nobody else can spend your money. That's a good idea, right? So you can, and only you can spend your money. New coins are created on average every 10 minutes. This is the second rule. When someone can prove that they've undertaken the work or used the energy required by the system at that time to create coins. And we'll talk a little bit about this as well. But new coins come into existence every 10 minutes or so. This is kind of an average, but it averages to 10 minutes, and the system is designed that no matter what happens, that average of 10 minutes stays the same. And people have to put energy into it. And many of you will have heard, oh, Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. This is part of the process of using energy. And I'll explain all the reasons why Bitcoin uses energy. But one of them is to fairly distribute the new coins that come into existence. So the coins themselves are rewarded to the person or organization who can provide proof of having done the work. And this work requirement changes based on how much work is being done, so that only one person wins the reward on average every 10 minutes. So, if I was the only person working, I wouldn't have to do much work. But if a million people were working, well, it would require as much work as a million people could do, and only one of the million people could win the reward every 10 minutes. And we'll go into a little bit of detail of that in the coming slides. The total number of new coins that are created per every 10 minutes gets cut in half periodically, and they're on a fixed schedule. And this getting cut in half leads to there only ever being 21 million whole Bitcoins that will ever exist. And the way that worked is, in the initial 4-year period of Bitcoin's existence, every 10 minutes, 50 coins were created. That led to 10,500,000 coins, which if you're good at math, you'll see that's half of the total supply was created in the first 4 years. Half of the remaining supply got created in the next 4 years because the reward got cut from 50 coins to 25 coins. So half as many as 10.5 million got created. And every 4 years, that number gets cut in half. And the sum of that series converges. It converges at a number 21 million. So there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. And the issuance of them gets scarcer and scarcer every 4-year period. We're currently at a period, it was originally 50, there was 25 coins per 10 minutes. Then there was 12.5 coins per 10 minutes. And now we're in the period where there's 6.25 coins per 10 minutes. When the next period happens, there will only be 3 1/8 coins per 10 minutes. So it's getting scarcer and scarcer, the issuance over time. And every single creation of a coin and every single spending of any amount of coins is recorded in a distributed ledger that anyone can make a copy of. That distributed ledger, many of you will have heard the term blockchain. That distributed ledger is often called the blockchain, but it's mostly, it has a couple of other things in it, but it's mostly a history of every transaction that ever took place on Bitcoin, so that you can actually audit it and see that no more than the number of coins that should be in existence are in existence, and you can see exactly at which addresses they sit. All of this is outlined, all of these rules were outlined in a famous paper that was issued in 2008 by a mysterious person who went by the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. It's known as the Bitcoin White Paper. This document you see behind me is a very fancy reproduction of it in poster form. It's very easy to read. You can see this isn't really big. It's probably about as big as the Declaration of Independence of the United States. So you can actually read it. So there's a couple of parts that get mathematical, but it's very easy to digest. And all these rules were discussed in that white paper, and you can read them for yourself. It's written in very plain English and very, very easy to comprehend. So we just have a few rules, but sometimes from simple things, complex things arise. And so why were these the rules that were created, and what are some of these really interesting characteristics that emerge from these rules? Well, the first is it's decentralized. And I've mentioned this word before, and I've mentioned many of these points before. That means it has no rulers, right? Nobody can take charge, control Bitcoin, change the rules. It has no employees. Nobody can mess up their job. Nobody can provide you bad customer service. There's nobody to deal with. That comes with responsibilities as well if you're using this, but it's not a human system, right? And participants, like anybody on this call, like myself, can come and go as they please. There is no single point of failure, right? There's no head of Bitcoin that if we arrest that person or murder them or do anything to them, that Bitcoin will fail. Anyone who runs the software of Bitcoin, and as long as the Bitcoin software is running anywhere on any computer in the world, Bitcoin as a system is running. No one computer is considered the head node, the master node. They're all equal nodes in Bitcoin. And so anyone in the world running this, and it's free software that anybody can download from anywhere on the internet and run on any computer. So every computer in the world is potentially a Bitcoin node. So it's completely decentralized. It's also, it's funny, many of these words are like opposites of things Decentralized is the opposite of centralized. You may not have come across that word. Permissionless is another word you may not have come across, but you've come across the word permission. So this is the opposite of needing permission. It's permissionless. Anyone can participate without requiring any permission. And by anyone, I mean anyone, anybody on this call doesn't need anybody's permission to participate. Anyone anywhere in the world can participate. You don't need to be a citizen of a particular country. You don't need to be a particular age. There's no requirements of education. There's no racial screening. There's no profiling of any kind. As long as you can generate a random number and have access to a basic simple computing device, as simple as a mobile phone, you can participate in Bitcoin, and you don't have to identify yourself. You can run a node, you can send and receive Bitcoin, you can try to mine Bitcoin. So the system is completely permissionless. The system doesn't even understand that human beings exist. And that's why it doesn't require permission. It doesn't require that you identify yourself as a human being. And so you don't need permission. Here's another thing. We all know what censorship is. What does it mean to be censorship resistant? It means that nobody, not even a government, can stop someone else from participating in the system. So people can participate kind of anonymously, pseudonymously. As long as you have access to a device connected to the internet, you can participate in Bitcoin, which is what I described above. So it prevents people from being prevented from using it. And we all know what something that's fragile is. We think we know what the opposite of fragile is. We think, oh, if a piece of glass is fragile because it can be broken easily, maybe like a wooden block is not fragile because it's rugged, it's hard to break. Anti-fragile is actually a different concept. It's if you imagine something that's fragile is easy to break with some amount of force, something that's anti-fragile is actually something that gets stronger the harder you attack it, the harder you hit it. And this is a really interesting phenomenon. There's actually a book called Anti-Fragile that, if you're interested in this topic, is worth reading. Something like life itself is anti-fragile, right? The more we subject life on the earth to harshness, the harder the conditions it faces, the more it evolves and the stronger it gets, right? And eventually life, after being on earth for billions of years, could actually survive a giant comet strike from outer space that was huge. Life itself is anti-fragile. It's very, very hard to destroy all of life. You can kill an individual living thing, but it's hard to destroy life itself. Bitcoin as well is this kind of anti-fragile entity. I shouldn't say kind of, it is an anti-fragile entity, and it can't be stopped. And in fact, one of the interesting things that happens is every time it gets attacked, it manages to repel the attack and learn how to absorb the attack and become stronger and anticipate future attacks. So the more you attack Bitcoin, the stronger it gets. And I do have one article in my series called something like Why Everything That Should Hurt Bitcoin Only Makes It Stronger, that explains a little bit more about how Bitcoin becomes anti-fragile. So this is a pretty neat thing, right? It's very different from anything that we've seen already. And this is maybe a good part to just kind of stop and take any questions anybody has on any of these topics that I've discussed so far. I know they're a little bit sophisticated, but I can try to simplify them or go into a little bit of detail if anybody has any questions. So I'll wait a couple of, yeah, go ahead.
I've got one. Does
Sure.
it sounds like the Bitcoin code doesn't change or hasn't ever changed?
What it cannot change, so there are improvements that are made to it, but you can't change those rules that I described, because what would happen is if you tried to change the rules in a way that said, well, I can spend somebody's coins that aren't, I can spend somebody else's coins, and you tried to spend somebody else's coins and in a way that violated those initial rules, every single other person running Bitcoin in the world, every single other computer running Bitcoin in the world would reject that attempt to change that rule. If you tried to create more Bitcoins than were allowed by the rules, every single computer in the world would reject those rules, because every time anybody running Bitcoin communicates with anybody else, that communication needs to adhere to the rules, and it's validated using cryptography, which is a kind of math that allows people to prove things. And as a result, the code itself can be changed. It can be debugged, for example. It can be improved. It can be made to run faster. But anyone who tries to change the rules finds themselves isolated and cut off from the network. So that's a really good question.
Thanks. And are code changes how Bitcoin learns to be stronger the more it's attacked?
In many ways, yes. So, for example, when Bitcoin was first created, it didn't have a limit as to how big every set of transactions that occurs every 10 minutes could be. And the creator realized, oh, well, somebody could actually attack Bitcoin by publishing millions and millions of transactions, and then nobody would be able to store those transactions in the blockchain, and so it wouldn't be decentralized anymore. So they put a limit that said, well, we can only publish 1 megabyte worth of transactions every 10 minutes. And so that was like a change in the code that prevented Bitcoin from being attacked in what's called a certain type of denial of service attack that would undermine its decentralization. So changing code is not the only way that Bitcoin learns to defend against certain types of attacks, but it is certainly one significant way that Bitcoin becomes better and demonstrates its anti-fragility. Great question. Any follow-ons to that? All right, I'm gonna proceed, and we'll come back around things. So now, well, we've talked about this system, this interesting system of digital money that has all these bizarre characteristics. Let's talk a little bit about what is money, and then we'll merge the two things together. So let's think a little bit about money. What do we need money to do? There's books and books written about money. So if you feel that I'm a little too concise here, I apologize. I only have a few minutes. So there's three specific kinds of functions we want money to do. We want it to store value over time, right? I want to earn some money today. I want to earn some value today, some spending power, purchasing power. And I don't want to spend it this exact minute that I earned it. I want to save it for later when I'm older, when I have free time, whatever. So we need money to store value over time. We want money to allow us to change the scale of our purchases. So I might want to earn a lot of money over a long period of time so I can buy a house. Or I might earn a lot of money doing something, working a whole day, but I just want to buy a sandwich, which is only a portion of it. So I might want to buy something big or something small. Money allows us to scale it, right? Something can be a lot of money or a little money. So we wanted to change the scale. And of course, we want to send value across space, right? So I earn my money in one location, but I want to spend it in a different location. So money allows us to take value and move it across time, space, and change its scale. These are the kind of interesting mathematical and physical concepts. And ultimately, it's a really interesting reduction and simplification of what this strange thing that we call money actually does. And if we want money to do these things, we need it to have a bunch of important properties so that these features don't break down. And I'll talk very quickly about all of these different terms here. So the first thing is we want it to be durable, right? Because we want to spend money over time. So we don't want to have money and then we look at it in a few weeks and it all eroded away, right? That's why we don't use bananas as money, because they're not durable. They rot and they disappear. So we want money to last a long time because we want to store value over time. We want it to be securable because we want, whether it's over time, scale, or space, we don't want to lose our money. We don't want someone else to take our money while we're waiting for time or moving across space. Because we want to change the scale of our money, like I may have a lot of money and I just want to spend a little bit, we want it to be divisible. Right. So I may have $100, but I only want to spend $1 for a cup of coffee. So we need to be able to divide it. And I may have a whole bunch of dollar bills. I want to be able to recombine them because I want to buy a house. So I need millions or at least 1 million of these dollars. So we want it to be divisible and recombinable. We want it to be transmissible. You know, I need to be able to, and exchangeable. So I need to be able to hand it over to somebody. If I can't give it to somebody, it's not really a money. And it's important that it be scarce. And scarcity is important because if money becomes abundant over time, then it loses its purchasing power, because really when people want to trade something that they have that's scarce in exchange for money, well, then that money itself has to be scarce. And ultimately, we also want it to be verifiable. That means we want to know that it's really the thing that we're saying is money, that's not counterfeit money, right? So if it's dollars, we want to know that they're real dollars that other people recognize. If it's gold, we want to know that it's not fool's gold or some lump of lead painted in gold. We want money to be verifiable. So these are considered by, again, all the academics who've studied money over time to be the core and essential characteristics of money. There's several others that are of less importance, but we're not going to concentrate on those today. It's not an attempt to evade them. It's an attempt to be concise. So let's consider gold. Gold has been money for 5,500 years, right? It's got a very long tradition. Goes back. We see it in the ancient pyramids in ancient Rome. We know that humanity has used gold for a long time. And let's consider it across the dimensions that I just mentioned. So one, why do we use gold? Why have we used gold for 5,500 years? Because it's really durable. Like none of it's rotted away. Gold doesn't even tarnish as far as metals, which happens to many metals. So it lasts forever without tarnishing. It's terrific on its durability. How securable is it? Well, you can secure gold if you have a good amount of it. You need a vault so that it's not easy to take, and you probably need guards to guard the vault, or maybe have a really good place to bury it. So we all know the history of gold. Many of us haven't really dealt with gold because it hasn't been money in most of our lifetimes, or at least while we've had money to have. But it's actually pretty hard to secure gold. It's expensive. You can't really keep it in your pocket. It's heavy, and because it's so valuable, you need to guard it. And most of the world's gold is located in several very secure locations. Is it divisible? I see a typo here. Is it divisible and recombinable? Well, again, this is a really hard thing to do with metal, right? If you had a gold coin and you wanted to divide it even in half, let alone to take 1/100th off of it, you wouldn't be able to do it yourself, right? You need very special equipment to split gold. You need to melt it down to recombine it into a larger quantity. It's really only goldsmiths and chemists and people with very specialized skills and equipment that can divide and recombine gold. And as far as transmissibility and exchangeability is concerned, like if gold is easy to exchange, if it needs to be physically exchanged. So if you can get, if you're at the same location as a person, it's easy to exchange gold with somebody. But if they're far away, if they're overseas, if they're halfway across the country, if they're in Seattle and you're not, it's very hard to transmit gold. I have someone who's wanting to join the call now, who are probably a little bit late. So I'll invite them in, and to whoever joined the call, I'm already in the middle of the course. There will be a recording available afterwards. So I just ask that you put yourself on mute, and then you're welcome to ask questions later on in the course. All right. So gold is only easy to transmit or exchange with other people if you happen to be in the same location as them. And if it's a lot of gold, then you probably again want security guards and witnesses present to confirm that you actually transmitted or exchanged the gold. So gold is kind of hard to transmit. Is it scarce? Which is the other feature we want of money. Well, gold is scarce. Only about 1 to 2% of the entire stockpile of gold is discovered every year, but that compounds and it adds up over time. So after about 30 years, every 30 years, the supply of gold in the world roughly doubles. So gold is scarce, but it's not finitely scarce. It's who knows how much gold is actually out there. And as we start to reinvigorate the space age, there's potentially a lot of gold out in nearby asteroids and things like that. So it may not be as scarce as we think it is on Earth, or as hard to extract as we find it on Earth. And is it verifiable? Well, gold is actually very hard to verify. If I handed you a piece of metal and I said, this is gold, you might not know, you might not be able to do it, right? You'd have to weigh it, you'd have to analyze it with special equipment, and you wouldn't know that it's exactly the right amount. We hear the term money debasement all the time. That term actually comes from from a technique where people used to clip small amounts of the base metal off of gold coins. And so the base metal was gold. And when you took some of it off, you were debasing the coin. So the term debasement has its root in the fact that it's really, really hard to verify the quantity of gold and the fact that gold is actually real. So that's gold in terms of those criteria that we discussed at money. So gold is relatively good as ultimately, when you put all these things together, gold is good as a relatively long-term store of value because it's durable and relatively scarce. But the truth is it failed overall as a money in a global economy because of its limitations on all these other dimensions we looked at. Right? It couldn't be, when global trade became really important, this is all essentially after World War II, when the world was unified. Gold was just too difficult to verify. It was too difficult to transmit. It was too difficult for individuals to hold and secure. And so gold ultimately failed at money. It all got held in just a handful of centralized locations and ultimately both confiscated and abandoned by governments. Right? In 1971, there was a seminal moment in gold's history where the gold standard was abandoned by governments worldwide. So while the US dollar didn't come into existence in 1971, what a US dollar means changed dramatically in 1971. Before then, a dollar was a fixed amount of gold. Afterwards, it was detached from gold. And so was every other currency in the world. So the currencies before 1971 had a fixed exchange rate to one another because each one bought a precise amount of gold. That was called the gold standard. And that ended up ending in 1971. There's a really interesting website that kind of documents what's happened in the world on all sorts of interesting dimensions before and after 1971. The site is called WTF Happened in 1971. And there's some really interesting statistics there. So some of you may want to visit that site afterwards and see what happened when we left the gold standard and moved to the new standard, which is government money. Government money is also known as fiat money. Fiat is the Latin word for by decree. And so really government money, fiat money, is money by decree. It says this piece of paper is worth $10. That piece of paper is worth $1. some other piece of paper is worthless because it doesn't have, because the government doesn't say it's worth something in particular. So this is money by government decree. And let's take a look at government money's features on these dimensions. So is government money durable? Yes, absolutely. Your balances in your accounts or your dollar bill stuffed under your mattress, they last. They don't rot. They don't disappear. They're not like bananas. And you can turn in your old bills for new ones in case you were worried that they're getting a little crumpled. Is it securable? Like, can you keep it secure? Well, it actually is easier to secure than gold because it's easier to store smaller amounts. Like not many of us keep any sizable amount of gold in our home, but we can keep cash in our home. But large amounts do require a custodian. You wouldn't necessarily want to keep $1 million of cash in your home. So you trust a bank that has security measures and has databases, if it's keeping the money digitally, that are trusted by other banks in the system, by other people in the system. Is it divisible and recombinable? Absolutely it is, right? Like we used to make change when we dealt with physical money all the time. Now that we use digital money, if something costs $384.26 and you tap your bank card against it, that's exactly how much gets taken away. And when more gets in, it just adds up to the total number. So it's very easily divisible and recombinable. And that does not represent an obstacle for its usability. Is it transmissible and exchangeable? Absolutely, it is. Again, both digitally and in its little physical format of bills and coins. In the worst case, you have to pay some fees to send money from one location to another, like if you're using PayPal, or if you're sending it internationally, you end up having to pay bigger fees because you generally have to convert it from one country's currency to another. So that ends up with exchange rates and can get quite expensive. People who work in one country and try to send their salaries back home to another country often find this to be very expensive. Like there are countries whose whole economies are based off of workers going to earn a living in a foreign country. And in many cases, in addition to the income taxes they have to pay, the conversion can be upwards of 20, as high as 30% at times. And is it scarce? Well, this is really the biggest problem that we have with government money. It's not scarce at all. It's not even close. And currently we're going through an era where that supply of money is inflating at really an unbelievable speed. I'll show you some charts in the next couple of slides. And is it verifiable? It's entirely a trust-based system, right? It's a trust-based system in the electronic realm. Like if you go to your bank and they say that they have $500 million, you can't verify that, right? You have to take their word for it. And if the government says, well, we've printed 2 trillion of it, you can't verify that. You have to believe it. So it's a trust-based system. Counterfeiting has always been a small problem when third parties are counterfeiting money, but there's apparently many tens or even hundreds of billions of counterfeit US dollars out there sitting in bill format. And it's very hard to know what happens inside of computer systems because they're very hard to audit, especially for people like you and me. But it is generally verifiable. So I have a couple of Canadian charts. I know we have Canadians here. I have a couple of US charts here. When I talk about the fact that the money supply is inflating rapidly, I want you to know I'm not exaggerating. The Canadian money supply, when the COVID crisis hit in 2020, looks like what's defined as M0. There's different ways of measuring the money supply. Some is actual cash, some is cash plus credit, some of these things. This one measured as M0 shot through the roof. The one that's called M1 hasn't fared much better. It has been inflating all this time. Just in this short-term chart that I show, it's gone from $800 billion to $1.4 trillion. And the Americans haven't fared much better. What they call M1 went from $4 trillion to just under $7 trillion by mid-2020, from the start of 2020. And there's lots of these charts. This is a chart of the US national debt. I don't know if this looks familiar, right? Back in 1940, it was essentially $0 trillion. It hit $1 trillion in the early 80s. It hit $6 trillion or $5 trillion in about the year 2000, and it's growing really fast. This chart was compiled in 2020. In 2021, we've already had another several $billion worth of debt added onto it. This image may look familiar to you. I think it looks a lot like the the tallest building in the world, the Burj, or half of it, the Burj Dubai Tower in the United Arab Emirates. So it's a pretty steep curve of money that's being borrowed, that's essentially being printed as well. So that's fiat money and gold. So now let's look at Bitcoin and how it compares on these 8 dimensions to everything else. And I think this is when we talk about all these rules that went into Bitcoin and the technologies that it uses. What we can say is Bitcoin is the first time in history that a money has been engineered, right? And by engineered, I mean designed using technology. It's not just gold. Like gold, we happen to find some element that occurs naturally that has some really good characteristics of money. None really perfect, except for perhaps its durability. All the other ones somewhat compromised, and some it's really poor at. And that's like, before we had hammers, which are engineered to drive in nails, we had rocks, and we used to pound nails in with rocks, or things in with rocks. But now that we have gold, now that we have hammers, we don't need to use those things. So it's engineered, and we'll talk about all these things it's engineered. But when you engineer something, you can perfect it or come very close to perfecting it on a number of dimensions, and that's what we're about to see here as it relates to the features of money. So is Bitcoin durable, right? Let's talk about durability, the first thing. So Bitcoin lasts forever. As long as a single copy of that blockchain exists anywhere, that ledger, as long as it exists somewhere, it cannot, all the Bitcoins exist exactly where they were left, which is at addresses. This ledger, because of the cryptographic features of it, cannot be tampered with. You can go and make a change. Like you can take the file and you can change one bit in it anywhere. You can change a bunch of bits. You can say, oh, that address is mine. If you try to pass it on to anybody else, the software will immediately reject it. It will verify everything. All these cryptographic proofs need to be in there. The fact that the work had to go into it needs to be in there. If it's not in there, it gets rejected. So the terms are like immalleable. I think there's several other words that people use to describe this ledger, but it cannot be changed. It cannot be edited. It can only be added to, and only with things that comply with the rules. So Bitcoin lasts forever. Is it securable? Storing Bitcoin, you can store any amount of it, $1 billion worth of it or 1 cent worth of it. You can store any amount of it. You can't store more than 21 million Bitcoins because that can't exist, but you can store any amount of the finite supply of it. And you only need to keep a digital file. And ideally, you've protected that with a password. But as long as you have the digital file and the password, if you protect it with a password, that's all you need to store it. So you can actually you can store $1 billion worth of Bitcoin in your house if you have that much, and it'll be completely secure, and you can hide that file anywhere else. You can even hide that password, that digital file in your head, if you can memorize 12 to 24 words in order. So it's highly securable. You can hide it anywhere, right? Because it doesn't take physical space, because it's a digital file, it can be stored anywhere in the world. In fact, so you don't need a Fort Knox to store all the Bitcoin in the world. It can be stored all over the world by all sorts of different people. Very clever. Is it divisible and recombinable? Absolutely. Bitcoins, again, one of the questions that always comes up when I mention 21 million Bitcoins is, so, well, only 21 million people can have it. Bitcoins themselves, each one can be split up in the native protocol into 100 million units. So one Bitcoin is really 100 million of the teeniest units, which are generally called Satoshis. And they can be recombined in any quantity simply by typing out the amount. So if you have 0.1672 Bitcoin and you want to spend 0.0126 Bitcoin and send it to somebody, you just have to be able to type that into a computer, and that's exactly how much will be sent to them, and you'll have the remainder sent back to yourself as change. So it's very divisible, and it's equally recombinable. If you receive Bitcoin from one person to another and you want to recombine it, that's super easy to do as well. Is it transmissible or exchangeable? Yes, Bitcoins are sent over any information medium. We use the internet today because it's really convenient, but you can send them over smoke signal or satellites or something that might come someday to replace the internet. And once spent, they can't be unspent. So there's no disputability over whether a Bitcoin's been sent or not. Once that transaction enters the blockchain and sits in the blockchain for a few more blocks of addition, it's essentially impossible because of the durability of the blockchain to change it. And so you can send it, and you don't have to worry that if it's been sent to you, that it can be unsent. A sent Bitcoin, once it's had a little bit of time to sit, is essentially physically impossible to unsend, or physically impractical to unsend. Is it scarce? Yeah, I mentioned, right? The algorithm ensures that there can only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. So unlike gold, one of gold's better features was its relative scarcity, but this is absolute scarcity. Right? There only will be ever 21 million Bitcoins. There will not be 21.001. The people who run the protocol, because they, I have some Bitcoin, other people on this call have some Bitcoin, the chances of our saying, oh, we'll allow the protocol to change to allow more than 21 million Bitcoin is zero. You need consensus amongst everybody in the world who owns Bitcoin to agree to make a change to the rule. So its scarcity is fully enforceable. And is it verifiable? And again, this is one incredible feature of Bitcoin because it's engineered. Anybody on this call, you don't have to be a computer scientist, you don't have to be a goldsmith, you don't have to know how all the computers of the Federal Reserve work. Anyone running the software can easily check that any Bitcoins that were sent to them are the real thing, and that the entire blockchain that they have a copy of is actually valid and doesn't contain any fraudulent coins, any counterfeit coins inside of it. And you don't have to know how to do this. The code, of course, will do it for you, but you can check at any point in time that what you have is real and yours. So I think I've teased a little bit about this. How is it better than gold? Well, gold is bad at divisibility. It's very hard to divide a piece of gold accurately. It's very hard to verify gold. It's very hard to send gold anywhere other than handing it to a small amount to a person who's standing right across the table from you. And it's very, very hard to secure gold because it famously gets robbed all the time, and people lose it when they bury their treasures. So that's how Bitcoin stands up against gold, right? When it comes to gold's strengths, gold is good at being durable and being scarce, but Bitcoin is just as durable and it's more scarce, and it does everything else that gold doesn't do really well. And we also know, like, you can't dispute the facts of history. Gold actually failed as money, right? History shows this because of its shortcomings. It ceased to be the money that everyone in the world used when 1971 happened and the gold standard ended. And now let's compare Bitcoin to fiat. Bitcoin can be self-secured even for large amounts, right? We really only keep spending money generally, and maybe a little bit of a rainy sum hidden somewhere in our house. You can store any amount of Bitcoin yourself. You don't need to trust a custodian for it. Bitcoin is inflation proof, inflation being fiat's greatest weakness, right? You can't store fiat over time. You can't take $1 and expect, or like it used to cost 10 cents to buy a can of Campbell soup. It now costs $1 to buy a can of Campbell soup, or it used to cost $10,000 to buy a house. It now costs $1 million to buy a house. You can't store your wealth. You can't store value for a very long period of time with fiat money because it loses its purchasing power by design, quite typically. And I have one article in the series that I have. It's called "Why Bitcoin is the Best Way to Save Money," and I recommend reading that. That one's only a 2-minute read, and it goes into this. But so you can actually use Bitcoin as a long-term saving vehicle. You can buy some Bitcoin today that you plan on not needing to spend for 5, 10, 50, 100 years, that you plan on leaving to somebody else, and Bitcoin will be just as scarce a share of the Bitcoin as it was at the time that you bought it. Bitcoin can be sent anywhere in the world for the same price as sending it from one of your pockets to the next pocket. Right? Distance doesn't exist in cyberspace. So if I'm sending a Bitcoin anywhere in the world, it doesn't matter. I'm making a transaction on the ledger, copies of which exist all over the world. So sending Bitcoin has nothing to do with space and time. And of course, there are different Bitcoins in different countries, like there are fiat currencies. So people who actually accept and spend Bitcoin don't have to worry about converting it from one local version to another. There's only one global version of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin cannot be seized by decree. No government can alter the ledger. Right? So no government can say we're taking 30% of everybody's Bitcoin. The laws of physics are the laws, and the government can't pass laws that violate the laws of physics or the laws of mathematics. So Bitcoin cannot be seized by decree, and it hides behind these cryptographic functions, or in order to spend it, you need these astronomically large numbers that are bigger than I can maybe provide some ways of thinking about these numbers, but these numbers are as big as all the atoms in the universe. And so you'd never be able to guess one of these numbers. And that's what you need to be able to guess to try to steal somebody's Bitcoin. So nobody can take your Bitcoin. So it's even government resisted. And this is part of that anti-fragility that we talked about before. So here's a cute little graphic. I'm throwing a few in here just to lighten up the content. And here's how inflation, the top is how inflation affects your purchasing power. Right? In 1998, 20 bucks would have bought your grocery cart filled with food. As time passed by, it buys less and less and less. I think I managed to almost buy a steak today with $20 when I went to the grocery store. Bitcoin's gone quite the opposite way. Let me go back here. In 2012, when Bitcoin was brand new, you couldn't really buy anything with one BTC, maybe a packet of sugar. Today, one BTC will buy you a Tesla, and Tesla accepts Bitcoin now. So its purchasing power has gone up quite a bit as more and more people have realized what a good form of money it actually is. So given all this that we've discussed, what is Bitcoin's killer app? Well, today, it's the store of value, right? People want to use Bitcoin to store value in the face of the worry that they have that fiat money is inflating very rapidly and it stands to lose its purchasing power. And this comes from the fact that Bitcoin's scarcity and durability combined with its security and its self-custodial ability make it the best store of value we've ever seen in history. We've never seen something that's going to outlast countries. It's going to last as long as the laws of math and physics last, which is probably as long as the universe is going to be around. And at the same time, it has a scarcity and durability characteristics that we need for money to be a store of value over time. Right? If something isn't scarce, it loses purchasing power over time. And if it's not durable, you don't have it. So you need it to be scarce and durable. And so that's why it's really great as a store of value. And this is kind of getting into the importance of what's happening with it as an investment. People who were using other things as a store of value are choosing Bitcoin instead. So they're selling the other thing and buying Bitcoin. And so as a result, we're seeing Bitcoin absorbing value that's being stored in fiat money. And a lot of people are converting their fiat money and their bonds, which are denominated in fiat money. All of these things get destroyed by inflation of the fiat money supply. So people are selling those things and buying Bitcoin. They're selling gold and buying Bitcoin, and gold has a monetary premium, and that monetary premium is dissolving. And all of this financial crisis that we've been through since the COVID crisis hit in 2020, gold hasn't really done anything. It's gone from 1,600, it's now sitting at maybe $1,750. And in the meantime, Bitcoin's gone from $4,000 to $58,000 at the time that I started this call. It moves around a little bit fast, so it might be not exactly 58,000 at the moment. If Bitcoin never goes to sleep, so while gold is not necessarily trading right now, Bitcoin is constantly traded. It trades nonstop all day long. And the same as we said about gold, we could also say the same thing about silver and diamonds. They're actually less scarce and less durable than gold, but their monetary basis is the same, and people do use them to store value. Stocks, we've seen the price of stocks go crazy, but stocks fundamental values are based off of their earnings multiples. And as the price goes up and the earnings don't necessarily go up, these earnings multiples get inflated and they become essentially unsustainable. Most of the corrections we see in the history of the stock market is when suddenly, everybody says, "Oh my God, we can't pay this multiple for something," and so the multiples drop, and the stock market prices correct, and the stocks end up not being as good a store of value as they had been the day before. Real estate is a wonderful store of value. It's very practical. We need homes to live in, but there's been there are many empty homes and condos right now that have been bought and bid out of the market for people who actually want to use them as residences because they're being used for speculation because people want to store their value in real estate. And so we're seeing very inflated prices. I don't know where everybody here lives, but here in Toronto, where I live, homes are at record prices, which most economists and professionals don't believe that can possibly be sustained. There's a lot of empty properties in Canada because so many, even foreign buyers, are speculating on real estate, and so homes and apartments sit empty. Young people are unable to afford homes, it's not really the best use of real estate to use it as a store of value, as a speculative asset. And so again, once the people who are using real estate as a speculative asset discover that Bitcoin's actually easier to buy, it's much more divisible, of course. It doesn't have transaction costs associated with it. They'll be moving their savings into Bitcoin, and real estate will become more affordable. But you don't want to be the one holding the bag. And it'll become what future generations use to store their savings. A lot of young people are recognizing the losing game that fiat money is as far as a savings vehicle is concerned, and they're buying Bitcoin right away. Or if they're getting inheritances, they're turning them into Bitcoin. So the upcoming generation is recognizing that this digital money with all these incredible money characteristics, and they live very comfortably in a digital world. They don't need to touch something to know that it exists. So these upcoming generations are using Bitcoin as a store of value. And that's its immediate, that's what's happening right now in the world today, and why we see Bitcoin's value rising so quickly. It's because it's stealing market share as a store of value vehicle. I'll make one more point about this. There really is no limit as to how much value Bitcoin can store, right? Unlike a company's shares whose value depends on the future expected profits of the company, the value of Bitcoin is simply how much monetary energy society chooses to store in it by those people who willingly choose it. And it is global and it is digital. So this is not an American phenomenon. It's not a North American phenomenon. It's not a Western Hemisphere phenomenon. It's not a only in free countries phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that everybody in the world can participate in. And more people in the world are beginning to participate in it. There's no limit as to how many people can participate. We talked about its permissionlessness in the early part of this thing. Everybody anywhere in the world, whether they live in a free country or a dictatorship or some kind of tyranny, whether they live in a wealthy country or a poor country, whether they themselves are wealthy or poor, whoever they are, everyone can use it, and they can all use it to store and transfer their wealth. So it's quite a unprecedented phenomenon. I'll try to share something cute. Here's a picture of $50,000 and a 1 kilogram bar of gold. That's about 2.25 pounds of gold. Both of these things, well, the pile of $50,000 is worth $50,000. The gold brick is worth about $50,000. And so I shared a post on Facebook recently saying the following, which I think condenses the lesson, this part of the lesson that I just taught. I said, imagine believing that this pile of paper with ink on it, which can be printed almost for free in unlimited quantity by lying politicians and tired old bureaucrats, is worth more than a Bitcoin, whose supply cannot be increased beyond the 21 million supply cap at any cost. Or imagine believing that this useless block of metal, which could be grabbed right out of your hand by any stronger person, is worth more than a Bitcoin, which is secured in a block of data that would take more energy than is available in the whole world to take away from you. Then imagine not owning any Bitcoin and instead owning paper and metal. It's so inferior. So that's my lesson about what is money and what is Bitcoin and how does it compare to the alternatives that we have today. I'll go to part 3, owning Bitcoin, but I'll open it up for questions now because I usually do get quite a few questions at this point. If anyone's trying to speak, you're all on mute, so you'd have to unmute yourself first. Is there anyone who wants to ask any questions at this point? I've either done a great job or a terrible job if nobody wants to ask anything. All right. I'll proceed. This next part of the course is actually pretty small, pretty short, and I'm just checking our time. So I should be able to finish it within 10 minutes even. Owning Bitcoin. Okay, so what does it take to own Bitcoin? I'll do another funny tweet. This tweet is from the 16th of May in the year 2011. That's 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago. This poor guy, Greg Schoen, says, I wish I'd kept my 1,700 Bitcoins at 6 cents instead of selling them, that I bought at 6 cents instead of selling them at 30 cents. Now that Bitcoin's gone up to $8. So this guy, he left a lot of money on the table, $7.70 per Bitcoin, and he had 1,700 of them. So you can imagine, wow, that's like $20,000 that he left out. Of course, if you had 1,700 Bitcoins today, if he had not sold them today, he would have $1 billion or so. But it's hard to tell. What I'm trying to show here is I made the point earlier that Bitcoin can store any amount of value as more and more people recognize it. At the time that Bitcoin was worth 30 cents, it looked like the total supply of all Bitcoins ever would be worth $7 million. $7 million transacts in Bitcoin every few seconds now. So this comes to the question, how much Bitcoin should somebody own? I mean, it of course depends, right? Like, do you have a lot? Do you have a little? Do you have a lot? Have you developed a lot of confidence in the system at this point? Do you understand it well enough? Do you know how to secure your coins? These are all the questions one needs to answer. But one thing you should consider Bitcoin is as an insurance policy. You can consider it as insurance against price inflation, or even what some people are more concerned about, which is ultimate currency failure, if governments continue to produce fiat money out of control and it just spirals into a hyperinflation cycle. Bitcoin is not going to hyperinflate. It's not going to inflate at all. There's only ever going to be 21 million of them. And so you may want to secure some portion of your wealth as an insurance policy against something happening to the national currency or the national currencies across the world. Some people use it to diversify their portfolio. It doesn't behave like the stock market behaves according to two things, right? We talk about its fundamental value being the future expected earnings of the companies, but there's also the money printing that takes place to try to encourage stimulation of the economy. And often people who receive those funds use them to store value in things like stocks, which drive the value up. So Bitcoin's value doesn't move along with other stores of value. So it provides diversification. You can ultimately use it as your primary or supplemental savings vehicle instead of trying to store wealth in all these other things that we try to store wealth in. Right? Like it's really stressful to, if you have some wealth, to figure out how to preserve it. You have to manage stocks and manage bonds and find bank accounts and find all these kinds of instruments. Bitcoin is a very steady thing, which is if you believe in the scarcity argument and the durability argument, then you don't really have to do much managing of Bitcoin. You just hold on to it and you don't have to trade it. You don't have to do anything fancy with it. Bitcoin, it came into existence in 2009. It didn't really have any value at all until about 2011. For those of you who are familiar with reading stock charts, these are just every year Bitcoin's returns. If you take a careful look at the vertical axis, though, it's logarithmic. So it starts at 10 cents, then goes to $1, then $10, then 100, 1,000, 10,000, and $100,000, the value of a Bitcoin. And so I don't have this chart is a couple of months old, so it actually only shows. Well, actually, it shows Bitcoin hitting. It's only a month old. It shows Bitcoin hitting a high of 57,000. It's gotten a little bit higher than that in 2021, but in 2011 it traded in a range of under $1 to it closing under $10, and then the next year it traded in a range under $10 to under $100, and then it traded from over $10 to just under $1,000. And you can see it had a couple of off years, but today Bitcoin in 2021 started at just under 29,000 and has been as high briefly as just over $60,000. Bitcoin is on this logarithmic exponential trajectory to continue to attain value as the entire population of the world discovers its characteristics and becomes more and more confident with it and transitions more and more value into it. So you may now be asking yourself, how do you get some Bitcoin? There's really two ways to have Bitcoin, and I kind of jokingly say about this, but it's actually quite dead serious. So the first is to buy real Bitcoin from a Bitcoin exchange, something like, if you're in the States, Swan Bitcoin, or if you're in Canada, Bull Bitcoin, or if you're in the UK, CoinFloor. There's other more famous companies, but I don't necessarily encourage them because they'll try to bamboozle you into buying something that isn't Bitcoin. So you can buy Bitcoin on these exchanges and you can withdraw it. And by withdraw it, that means take physical personal custody of it to a good Bitcoin wallet. And Bitcoin wallets exist as software wallets, like something called Bitcoin Core, which is the original software that runs Bitcoin, or there's something called Blue Wallet or Electrum. And then there's also hardware wallets, which are really Bitcoin signing devices. They allow you to sign Bitcoin transactions with all the cryptographic requirements. And they're devices that keep this signing information away from the internet, so nobody can hack into it. Like, your computer is potentially a target for a hacker to get into, but these things are offline so that they're not attached. And there's something called a cold card, there's something called a ledger. So if you buy those pieces of hardware, you can actually store the keys to your Bitcoin on these things, and you don't have to worry about some remote hacker from halfway around the world potentially infiltrating your device. The second way to own Bitcoin is to invest in an instrument that does nothing but custody Bitcoin and make itself available using the existing financial system. So in the United States, GBTC, the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, is something that's been around for a number of years. It's a closed-end fund that does nothing but hold Bitcoin. And in Canada, we now have 7 or 8 closed-end funds and also exchange-traded funds that do nothing but hold Bitcoin. And so they just track the price of Bitcoin as closely as they possibly can according to the market. They try to maintain as low management fees as they can. And you can hold them in your brokerage account and in your registered accounts that are kind of like the tax sheltered retirement accounts. So that's another way to hold it. But I just point out the difference between these two things is when you hold real Bitcoin in a device in your own possession, whether you store it in your backyard or your home or your secondary property or up in your head, that's unseizable Bitcoin, and you can do whatever you want with that. And it's real Bitcoin, and you can send it using the Bitcoin protocol. This other stuff is a financial instrument of the existing governed financial system, and that you can't, I can't send anyone here a stock of Starbucks, and I can't send anyone here a unit of GBTC or QBTC. I have to sell it for fiat, potentially realize capital gains tax, and then send them the money, and then they could buy one of these instruments if they preferred Bitcoin. So there's a distinction between the two. One is kind of like a personally held investment. The other is actual Bitcoin. Right? The first one's actual Bitcoin, and there's lots of other things you can do with Bitcoin if you own it. But the main idea is that you want to store it and have the choice of taking it with you wherever you want and spending it with you wherever you want, which is only true in the case of the first one. But I don't suggest that you not do the other one. Like if you have IRAs or TFSAs for Canadians or RSPs, it's a very valid thing if you like Bitcoin and you want to see the price appreciation of Bitcoin while enjoying the tax sheltered status of those protected funds. These secondary ways of holding Bitcoin are perfectly sensible. And if you're not comfortable holding it yourself yet, you may want to choose one of these custodial type solutions. The last slide of my presentation, the question I often get is people say, well, when should I sell my Bitcoin? At what point in time? And for those of you who saw the great movie in the early 90s called The Matrix, the neophyte Neo asks the master Morpheus, he says, this is a takeoff on a line from him. He says, what are you trying to tell me, Neo, or Morpheus, that someday I can trade my Bitcoin for millions of dollars? And Morpheus says, no, Neo, I'm trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to. And this very famous internet meme, it really just says, Bitcoin's going to become money someday. You won't have to sell it for what you think is money today. It is taking over the world. And in the same way that, digital photography may in its early days have seemed like some way to get a file to Walmart so that you or Costco so you could actually print your photos. Nobody does that anymore. Digital photos are photos, and this digital money will be money. And that's that's the whole course, folks. So I encourage you to get off of mute right now and feel free to ask whatever questions you have. I'm going to stop the screen share so I can see you all, hopefully.
Well done.
Thank you. There you all are. I see you all now.
Man.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Tomer.
Yeah.
Thanks. Appreciate
Thank
that.
I'm not sure I understand the volatility.
Sure. Yeah. Well, look, the volatility comes from there's demand and there's supply, and at moments in time there's a lot of buying pressure. So many people have heard some very positive piece of news about Bitcoin, and they managed to get their money onto exchanges, and so then they start bidding up the price of Bitcoin, and there's little supply, and people who hold Bitcoin haven't put it on the exchange to sell it. So you'll see the price go up very, very quickly, and then maybe that story fizzles out, or that story has extended its energy, and so that buying demand disappears, and the price finds a previous value where it has a lot of support rather than just the hype, the sizzle, right? Where it goes to where the steak is rather than where the sizzle is. This happens very quickly. When Bitcoin was very small, when it was only worth $1 billion or tens of millions of dollars, it was actually easy probably for people to manipulate the price, right? Like you didn't have to be the richest man on earth to manipulate the price of Bitcoin. Bitcoin's now worth over $1 trillion. It's actually the fastest asset in history to have achieved this value. It took Apple and Amazon and Google like 20 years each to achieve their $1 trillion market caps. Bitcoin's only 12 years old, and it's worth over $1 trillion already. So it's gone a lot faster. And I think that also speaks to the volatility, because things can happen so fast in the world. And Bitcoin doesn't just trade during 9:30 to 4 p.m. on non-holidays. Bitcoin trades everywhere in the world all at once, all over the world. There's exchanges everywhere, and all of them are open all the time. Things can happen very quickly. There could be a coup in some country, or China could pass some news about what they want to do with digital currencies or with Bitcoin itself. And so the movement can be very striking and very fast. One of the lessons learned from the 12-year history of Bitcoin is don't get too caught up looking at the very short-term history of Bitcoin. Zoom out. And if you zoom out at the charts, they actually look quite smooth. There's very small spikes in them. And you need to look at them on this logarithmic scale, because if you look at them with a non-logarithmic scale, it looks like a sharp U, right? It goes parabolic. So you need to smooth that out with this logarithmic scale. But when and if Bitcoin's parabolic rise is set to a plateau, that's what you're speculating on if you get involved in Bitcoin as a speculative asset. I think, again, I kind of encourage people. I know this is early in everybody's journey here, so but I kind of encourage people to think about Bitcoin not as a speculative asset. You may get rich, but as a protective asset. You're really after protecting your wealth here, and if you have wealth that you want to preserve, it may feel rocky at first because it has all this short-term volatility. But if you're stepping back and you're saying, I'm actually trying to preserve this for the long period of time, you come back to it in 5 years, you're going to be pleased with the purchasing power that you've managed to protect with Bitcoin, as opposed to juggling it and trying to make money in the stock market, or just holding onto it in a bank account passively, where you'll have lost a lot of purchasing power. It's a good question, Carolyn. I hope those answers provide you some feedback on it. What else have you guys got for me today?
So Tomer, I have a question. It might be a
Sure,
silly
Mona.
one, but I'm gonna ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so ideally it sounds like to me, you purchase Bitcoin, you store it, and you sort of set it and forget it, right? It's there long term. But in my scenario, for example, say I was one of the early investors, I have it stored away. For some reason, I need to tap into that.
Yep.
So now I'm exchanging it back to fiat. What are the tax implications on that? Like, how is that dealt with in our traditional sort of centralized system?
So you're expected to report your gains as capital gains and pay in both Canada and the US, and I think in every other country that's represented here. Capital gains taxes are lower than income taxes. They're typically half of income taxes, and you're expected to report it. Certainly not necessarily everybody does, and whatever the circumstances are what they are, but you're expected to report your gains as capital gains if you're disposing of any kind of asset that you've had a gain on. In Canada, though, and I don't believe America has ruled a judgment on this. And in Canada, years ago, the government said that if you actually spend it on services, though, it's deemed like, you can, if you have US dollars in a US bank account and you spend them, you don't have to pay capital gains tax if they've changed. And the government said the same thing about Bitcoin. And there's actually a service in Canada that's affiliated with bullbitcoin.com. It's called bills.com, BYLLS.com. And you can pay your bills with Bitcoin. And I believe, again, if you'll have to confirm with them, don't take my word for it, because I don't sell any of my Bitcoin, but you can pay your bills with it. And that falls under Canada's judgment that you're using it as a currency, and therefore do not have to declare a deemed disposition and pay a capital gains tax against it, because you're using it like a currency.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I have a question. I wondered, I read an article by Whitney Tilson, who's a renowned investor guy, and he talked about tethers, and he had a whole bunch of money. First he was critical of Bitcoin, then he put a whole bunch of money in, and then he found out what they do with this tether system that he thought kind of in some way devalued, or thought that people could somehow take advantage of the system through this tethering. Do you know anything about that? I wish I could tell you more
Yeah, no,
about the
I know
article,
exactly
but-
what you're talking about. And so I will say, that particular article, I'm familiar with it, and that particular article has been debunked. And I'll just explain what Tether is briefly. So a number of years ago, because it was so hard for people to get fiat money into and out of the Bitcoin system, because it was generally unregulated and unsupervised, and so banks didn't want to send money in and out, somebody created a token called Tether that was worth exactly $1. And they claimed that in order to create a tether, you actually had to send them $1. And so for every $1 that they had in their bank account, they issued one tether. And these tethers could be moved around the same way that Bitcoin could, outside of the banking system, using the blockchain technology and the cryptography technology. But because this was not an approved and regulated market, they were using offshore banks, and they had never had their supply audited. And so there was rumors that always milled about as to whether or not, well, are the tethers actually backed by US dollars, or did somebody just print imaginary tethers and use it to bid up the price of Bitcoin? This is what the article essentially discussed. It's largely been debunked. The company that issues, so first of all, there's several of these, they're called stable coins because they're stable, they stay at $1 forever. There's several other companies now that have been permitted to issue these fully regulated. So there's one called USDC, there's another one called USDG or GUSD, I think it's called, and those are fully backed and fully audited by the traditional auditing firms that we know, and the reserves are held at traditional banks. Tether ended up in a case with the U.S. Attorney General or the New York Attorney General over some of these things. They have effectively demonstrated at this point they had to have a small settlement. Like there's like $7 billion or $10 billion worth of tether out there, and they ended up having to have some kind of settlement that was related to disclosure. They paid, I want to say, maybe you can remind me, Lex, if you remember, but I think they had to pay a small fine, 18 million. So it was these are small fines in the financial industry, right? Like JP Morgan paid $1 billion fine last year for something. So in that industry, it's relatively small, but it wasn't for the basis of having made any false claims about the supply and backing of Tether. And there's a few articles which I can dig up and maybe share with you afterwards that do a really good job of going through the facts and debunking the Tether hysteria. So I think that's really an argument that's been put to rest. But this is one of the things, by the way, to Carolyn's earlier question, that create a lot of volatility over time, because a rumor would come out. There was one very notorious guy on Twitter, I think he called himself Bitfinex, because Bitfinex was the name of the company that issued Tether. And he created all kinds of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the legitimacy of Tether. And the company tried to retaliate. And so back and forth, as different rumors spread, the Bitcoin price would swing rapidly around some of those things. So Bitcoin trades on information, and whether that information is always true or not, when people have a hard time discerning the difference, that's something else. But like today, for example, right, Bitcoin's worth $1 trillion, and we see huge institutions putting their money behind it. And so even if Tether did turn out to not be fully backed, it's like the tail on the dog now. It's not the main thrust of what's driving the value of Bitcoin.
Thank you for that. I have one more question. I'm curious, you talked about taxes and capital gains, and how would you even calculate exactly what you made on it? You're buying it at different points, you buy it at 10K or 12K or, and then you want to pull out, I guess they report if you pull out more than 20 grand or something like that, right? And there's some sort of reporting that happens there.
Yeah, I think you'd have to speak to your tax accountant about how to do that. I think it's as the price is going up, it's generally, you have to declare when you're doing these things to the authorities what accounting tactic you're using, whether it's first in, first out, or last in, first out. Generally, as the price is going up, you prefer to do the last in, first out, so that you pay the smallest amount of capital gains tax that you have, and that's what people do. But your tax accountant is gonna be the person to help you out.
Okay, last in, first out. That makes a lot of sense.
I've been told in Canada, by the way, that for capital gains, you can't do FIFO or LIFO. They can only do average buy price. And yeah, I'm not sure of that, but that's what my MNP account tells me, and I assume he knows what he's talking about. They're a pretty respected accountancy firm.
If you can, never sell your Bitcoin. It's going to outlast your. It's going to outlast your country.
It is.
So I have a question.
Yeah. go ahead, Irene.
What happens to your Bitcoin holdings if you were to die?
That's an excellent
You know,
question.
my real estate will just go with no
Yes.
capital, gains.
Yes.
or
So you
anything.
need to make arrangements. There's quite a number of things you can do, but if you do nothing, your Bitcoins die with you and they become unspendable forever. There's no way. So you can leave instructions in a will with a lawyer that indicate where the keys are held and how and who you want to give those keys to. You can actually tie up your Bitcoins behind multiple keys, and you can give one to one heir and one to your heir and one to your lawyer, so that they can join them upon your death. That they can be, you can tie them under three transactions. So there's different ways. I think it's important, and different people have different tactics. There are actually companies that provide security setups where you'll have several devices that allow you to move your coins by yourself, but upon your death and your proven death, they can go to an accountant and a lawyer and themselves and resurrect and find a different way to spend your coins. So there are ways to estate plan with Bitcoin, but that's an excellent question. And probably quite a few Bitcoins have been lost. One of the things that I didn't mention is Bitcoin was created by a mysterious founder whose identity was never revealed. And that person disappeared after a year or so of supporting the protocol, because they knew that this thing needed to be decentralized and not targetable and to protect themselves. That person discovered about 1 million coins, it's rumored, it's expected through analysis of the blockchain, before anybody else was bothering to discover coins, because they were worthless at the time. That person may be dead. They have left. They're unlikely to ever return. There's 1 million coins that will probably never move, just belonging to the entity that created Bitcoin. And there were a lot of instances in the early days when Bitcoins were worthless, where people threw out CDs or floppy disks that they stored their Bitcoins on. So the actual active supply is significantly less than 21 million. And different people have tried really interesting analytical tactics to try to figure things out. But it's a good question you ask. And there's no way a Bitcoin, like if you die, if you take personal custody and you lose the wallet file and you don't have a backup of it, or you forget the password, there's no recovery. You can't write to the head of Bitcoin and say, hey, I lost my coins. Can you give them back to me? I dropped them down a sink. If they're gone, they're gone, right? There's nobody at Bitcoin. There's no place. There's nobody, and the Bitcoin community will not change the protocol to recover your coins for you.
Yeah.
If you lose them, you lose them.
Is it safer to use a middle person, if you will, like Kraken or?
It depends on the circumstance. The danger with them is that they go bankrupt. They're badly managed. They get hacked. They get seized by the government. So I would generally say it's safer to keep your coins yourself, provided that you educate yourself on how to do it. Bitcoin Mechanic here does this for people. But there's lots of people. There's companies that will help you take personal custody. They don't want custody of your coins. They will create a way for you to recover your coins if you lose them. There are easy ways to back this stuff up. It just, if many more people lose their coins than have them stolen, right? The security measures are such that you may become your own worst enemy, much more likely than somebody else will penetrate your system and steal your coins, as long as you have a strong password on them. And especially if you keep them offline, it's very hard for anybody to get them. Go ahead.
Have you touched on multi-sig at all, or would you rather not discuss that?
Well, yeah. So basically the way you spend a Bitcoin is you use what's called a cryptographic signature, which is you have a very large secret number, and you can prove that it corresponds to the published public number that is where your Bitcoins sit at. And usually you just sign it with just one large private number. But as I was kind of hinting at before, you can set up a Bitcoin address to be spendable by that it requires 2 signatures from 2 different private numbers, or 1 of 2, or 2 of 3, or 3 of 5. And so that becomes what's called a multi-signature address. And then you can create all kinds of interesting schemes with multi-signature. Like if you have 1 of 2, you can keep 1 key hidden somewhere and another one someplace else. Or if you have 2 of 3, you can have 2 heirs come together to spend it. But it's another way to add more security, but also potentially make your coins harder to spend. Is there a narrow point you wanted to make on multi-signature, Lex, in terms of security?
Yeah, of course. What you're saying there is what is the main thing to remember, which is complexity is the enemy of security, and you don't ever want to lock yourself out of your coins. But that said, it is programmable money, right? And you are able to make it have, like, there's a lot of companies now that offer like 2 of 3 multi-sig and stuff like that, where you have what you know how to have, but it's not enough to move coins. They have a key as well, and there needs to be both of them. And there can be a third key, which is, you know, your son or a relative or something you'd want to be your heir. And in the event that you passed away, they can prove their identity to this third party, and then the 2 of them combined can spend your coins. And if you ever fall out or there's a disagreement or anything like that, they can't go behind your back, because there's a third party that will verify everything and verify whether you're still alive and all that stuff. And these services are starting to mature now and become quite usable. And there's options like that, because there need to be, because there's far too many situations where people would just die and then those coins are just lost forever, and no one wants that. So yeah, it's a solvable problem, and it's maturing, but it's also something that needs to be done very carefully.
Thanks, Lex.
Thank you.
What can I ask what you recommend to secure the coins? Like, what is for right now, I have mine on like a zip drive with all the, passwords and code, the whole code deal. It's stored in my house. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, what if my house burns down? So, I mean, I can't put it on multiple devices, or I mean, I can spread it across multiple devices, but
Yes.
can I put the same coins on multiple devices?
Absolutely. What you're actually putting is the private key on multiple devices. It's the key. It's like you have 2 keys to your house, right? You have one that you keep in your pocket, and you have one that you hide under the floor mat, or
Okay.
something like that. In case you lose one, you want to have a backup of your keys. Absolutely, in a location, so that if they burn down, if the one location burns down, the keys aren't lost forever. And so you can make backup. Remember, your actual coins are stored in 100,000 places. They're stored on every copy of the blockchain. The permission to spend them is your key, and that's stored only in your possession. And so you need to make sure that does not get destroyed. And so do make a backup of your drives. Find a place to store them.
I got key. I put it in a safety deposit box, or I put it's somewhere.
Yeah, if you have a second property, if there's somewhere else that you can keep these things hidden, and you want to do so in an encrypted way, right? Like you can keep, because if it's unencrypted and somebody else gets their hand, like if you keep it in a safety deposit box and there's no password protecting it, then
right.
some bank employee can open the safety deposit box, see your keys, close it, right? Like steal your coins, put the device, put the floppy disk back, and you haven't seen what's happened. So it's really, really important to protect your copies of your keys behind a strong password, not an easy to hack one, not one that you also use to log into Facebook or to log into your Gmail. A strong
right.
password that isn't going to be guessed by a computer's brute force or by somebody who's hacked one of your other things. And
Can I add
what
to
is
that?
it? What is it that's on the zip drive? What is it that's on? You put a
it's
zip
called
drive
a wallet
in
file. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
called so you probably have what's called a wallet file. And if you have, and one thing I will say is, if you didn't set it up with a password on the way in, it's sitting there unencrypted, and that's a very risky way to store your Bitcoins, because if somebody gets that file, they can spend your Bitcoin. So
I did set it up with a password on the way.
terrific. Okay, terrific.
The
So
Nano X or Nano S or something.
Oh, okay. So you have what's called a hardware wallet, And that's a very secure device, and it's a very good thing. And it may have given you as well, like a 24-word seed phrase or a 12-word
Yeah,
seed phrase.
yeah.
Okay, that's another way to recreate. If the Nano burns down and you've stored that 24-word seed phrase somewhere else, that will allow you to spend your coins. If somebody else finds that 24-word seed phrase, they have stolen all your coins. They have everything that the rules require to spend your coins. So you want to keep that well hidden. Lex wants
But
to
not
say
if they
something.
don't have the zip not if they don't have the Nano.
No, if they
as
don't
well.
have, if
don't-
they don't need the Nano, if they get your 24 words. Your 24 words is the recovery in case you lose your Nano. So and I know one thing Lex is about to say. Under no circumstances, ever, never, under any circumstance, enter those 24 words into a computer. Right? Like there will be some phishing site that will say, "Hey, in order to connect your Nano to this thing, they will try to get those 24 words are your Bitcoins. They're the permission to spend your Bitcoins. And so if you enter those 24 words, your coins are gone. That somebody will spend them. Is there something else you wanted to add to that?
What's the point of the wallet if you don't need the zip, the thing you plug in the computer? What's the point of that if you have the 24 word, if all you need is the 24 words?
Well, you need some piece of, go ahead, Lex, I'll let you.
So the 24 words are a backup for the private keys, which are on the thumb drive. So the thumb drive is all you generate the transaction in some way, and then that's signed with the private keys. And those private keys are the sensitive data, right? So they can't be on a general purpose computer or a phone. So they're on this little device you have. If you lose that device or it gets destroyed or whatever, you need a way to upload the private information to a new device. And that is what the 24 words are. Or in your case, it will be 12 words because you're using Ledger. So that's what I was going to say before as well is you want to keep that offline, right? As Tom Ayer already said, you keep it offline and you make sure it never touches anything digital. Don't accidentally hold your phone over it while you're while you're using your phone and it's on your desk. But you can also back it up onto metal, right? And there's loads of companies that make these seed plates now where it's just, they give you a punch and a plate with letters on it and you can just hammer in the 24 words. And then even if your house burns down, you can still get it back. And the other thing I wanted to add as well was the reason safe deposit boxes and things like that aren't so great is because this isn't about physically possessing those words. It's just about someone learning them. And if someone opens it, sees them, memorizes them or writes them down themselves and puts it back in, you never know that happened. It's not like gold where if someone goes in your safe deposit box, it doesn't matter, the gold's still in there. Like if they learn that information, then they can spend your coins. So they can, and you would never know it happened. That's why it's really hard and really serious securing these things.
So you in order to spend your coins yourself, you need a device that can do the cryptographic signatures. That's what your Nano device does. It's also storing the private keys. But in case you lose it, you need a way to get a new device and restore the private keys on it. That's what the 24 words are. But anyone who has those 24 words can get a Ledger Nano device.
Can do the same thing.
And can do the same thing. So that's really, really crucial. I think probably the way that the most coins have ever been stolen from people is tricking people into surrendering their 12-word backup phrase, or people just taking poor security of it and leaving it around, or like uploading it to their to their iPhone or something, so that they.
What's your recommended process?
Lex, how do you recommend people store their 24-word seed or the 12-word seed?
So everyone's a little different. Everyone has different requirements. We're just asking about how to store the 24 words, not generate or anything like that. Am I understanding?
Yeah. Like how do you keep your? What's the safest way to not lose it, but to not get it stolen? You don't want to lose it yourself, right? And not know where it is. You don't want your house to burn down. There's got to be Yeah.
So the first suggestion I'd make is don't try and memorize them, because you might not use them for 10 years, and that's no good. The second suggestion is they need to be done just offline. So it doesn't matter how secure you think your computer is, you've got to turn it into physical security, because humans are just too awful at digital security. So it's a pen and paper, but really you want to go metal, because pen and paper, I've heard stories of people spilling their drink on a piece of paper with their 24 words on it, and it's gone. They just lost all their coins because they knocked over a jar of whiskey. I've seen it happen. So you want to get a piece of metal and hammer the words into it, because that protects from water and fire, and get a safe and secure it somewhere in your house. And that's a pretty good method. It's not bulletproof, of course, because if someone breaks into your house, they'll go straight for the safe, right? But there are additional things you can do to secure it, like secret 25th words, which mean you can create decoy wallets. If you add a 25th word, you create a completely different wallet, but you can put a tiny amount of Bitcoin in the 24-word wallet, and then that serves as satisfactory for the thief, and they never know to search every possible combination of additional words to find new wallets. And that's a way to help it. Another way is if you have like friends and family you really trust, and you can store a safe in their house. If it's in another country, even better. You can store something there as well, maybe half of it, but we do generally discourage people splitting their 24 words into different sections, because it kind of increases your security overhead without actually adding much security. It just makes things a bit more complicated. And of course, there's multi-sig as well. But yeah, your question was just about how to store the 24 words. And it's a hard thing to do, but generally a metallic backup and a safe should be good enough. And if someone does break into your house, you should have the ability to move your coins before they do. So that's about as good as you can get without getting into more complex stuff like multi-sig.
And let me just add, as somebody who's sort of gone down this road recently, literally don't rush into that process. It's been 6 months. I bought it on a centralized exchange. I knew that wasn't the ethos of Bitcoin, nor was it I wanted long-term, but I've literally been trying to educate myself. And this was really helpful, by the way. So that was really awesome. But it can take a while for you to understand enough about how to save it, to take possession of your keys. And there's literally Trace Myers, an early adopter. Tomer, I think you and I have talked about this, where he said that you're a third level citizen when you buy it on an exchange. You're a second level citizen when you take possession of your own coins. And you're a first level citizen if you actually run a node. And again, these are just stages in learning. And the learning curve is pretty steep unless you happen to be an engineer or have a math mind. Like Carolyn, you probably get this stuff better than I would, for example, because you're an engineer.
I don't want people to get too intimidated from what we described, because it isn't, there's careless things you should avoid doing, but you don't have to be an engineer to.
No. But all I'm saying is there's a learning curve, and you need to,
yes,
everyone's appetite for risk is different.
right.
I will say it this way. I didn't trust myself well enough to take possession of my keys very quickly, even though I knew that was the goal.
Right.
I might have learned that in week 2. I'm still, in that learning curve, and it's 6 months down the road.
Sure.
That's all.
Sure. I did just want to say it's like an hour and 45 minutes in. No, if people want to leave, you don't have to feel like that it's rude at this point to wave bye-bye. I'm happy to continue to take questions for as long as.
This has been unbelievably helpful. Thank you so much for doing it. I'm not leaving yet. I just want to thank you before I go.
Fair enough. I didn't want people to feel guilty.
In fact, actually, Tomer, I know that, again, we weren't going to talk specifically about business, but could you at least give those who are on this call an idea of the kind of adoption that's happening at the institutional and corporate level?
Sure. So 2020 was really a watershed year for Bitcoin on that front. Bitcoin was very much a retail investor phenomenon, just ordinary folks like us, and maybe a handful of businesses here and there. But in 2020, we saw, and certainly through to today, we saw some businesses becoming concerned about the very topics we were talking about, and businesses had in the first and most famous case, a company called MicroStrategy, which had about $500 million of cash on its balance sheet. The CEO became concerned that the dollar was going to lose its purchasing power as it was inflating away quickly. So he did a bunch of research into whether he should buy gold or silver or Bitcoin or what, and ultimately concluded that he should buy Bitcoin. He put the he said he was going to do this and let shareholders tender their shares beforehand. After a small number of them did, he used all the cash reserves that were left over to buy Bitcoin. He's continued to buy Bitcoin with all the profits of the company. He actually raised debt to buy Bitcoin. So I think they now own like $3.5 billion worth of Bitcoin just at this one company. Elon Musk, who's, depending on the day, the richest or the second richest man on earth, running Tesla and SpaceX. Tesla bought $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin and put it on their balance sheet. And we're seeing insurance companies and pension funds starting to put Bitcoin on their balance sheets. We're starting to see the banks allow their wealthy clients to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. The largest Bitcoin exchange in the world, Coinbase, is about to go public. And so they released a bunch of data today. They have something like $230 billion worth of people's coins in custody, but 130 of that 230 billion is corporate or institutional money. So institutions are starting to come to Bitcoin. This is another one of the reasons why you might anticipate, why you might look at that logarithmic chart and say, we haven't plateaued yet. It's one thing how much money the retail investors in the world have, which is trillions, but it's nothing compared to what institutions have, which is tens to hundreds of trillions of dollars. And just sitting on corporate balance sheets, sitting in pension funds, sitting in sovereign funds, right? Like
Zealand.
Nation. Like so some nations have already inquired about buying Bitcoin. New Zealand already has to a small degree. I mean, at that point, if everybody's racing to buy Bitcoin with their currencies, especially the people who are able to print them, at that point we enter the end game where we stop measuring things in dollars. But I don't think we're imminently there. I'm just saying that there's a lot of interest, and these things move fast, right? So Bitcoin went from a low of 4,000 at the same time that the stock market crashed in March of last year. We just passed the 1-year anniversary of that. It fell to about 4,000 and change, and it's worth $58,000 now. That it takes a lot of buying power to move that price up, right? There's tremendous volume of purchasing power, billions and billions and billions of dollars went into Bitcoin to drive that price up, much of it from institutional investors. And it's become, I think it was kind of this crazy idea in the early days, like this internet money, right? It was called magic internet money, was kind of the joke for it. But it's become a very serious asset class right now that all the most serious investors in the world are looking at. Some are dismissing it, some are accepting it, some are studying it, but nobody can ignore it, right? Even the people who hate it the most can't stop talking about it. So the joke is that it lives rent free in their minds.
Can you comment on what it means to put it on the books? Like, how are companies putting it on the books, and is that just?
I'll give you so MicroStrategy actually open source. They published their playbook as to how they did this. And again, I ask your tax accountant. This is maybe the second time I provide that answer. So, but my understanding of the general features of what they do is they buy Bitcoin at the time that they buy it. They mark it to market. So if they bought it, they just bought another $35 million worth yesterday or something like that, and they marked it at $59,000 a coin. They take the most conservative approach that they can. So if the price of Bitcoin goes down, they impair the asset, they write it down on their balance sheet. But if Bitcoin goes back up, they don't mark it to market. So they maintain the lowest book value that they can of it. I think that probably also gives them some kind of tax advantage, to be honest, because it marks a loss. But in any case, they do this, and they've published their whole playbook as to how they do the accounting for this, and how they have a professional audited custodian hold on to their Bitcoins for them. I haven't looked into all the details of that myself, but this one company, according to that playbook, is basically all of the company's value is stored. I mean, they do something in software, which is not really all that important for this conversation, but like of the company's $5 billion market cap, $4.8 billion, I'm just like estimating is the Bitcoins that they store. So it's a Bitcoin company.
Wow.
Sell some business intelligence software. But the guidelines are posted, and so you can work with your tax advisor to figure it all out. MicroStrategy is the name of the company. I think they publish all of their Bitcoin material. The CEO over the years accumulated a bunch of fancy domain names. So he's published all of this on a website, hope.com, which is easy to remember.
Hope.com?
Hope.com, yeah. There's lots of educational materials on there, and there is links to all of the information as to how, like they actually held an online conference that was attended by over 2,000 companies as to instructing companies how to hold Bitcoin on their balance sheet. So I didn't attend every one of those sessions. It's not directly relevant to me, but all that information was recorded, the lead up lectures into it, as well as presentations from the company's CFO and financial staff as to how to do that. So you'll find all of that on hope.com.
Okay.
And we did attend it, Tomer, Kevin and I, and it was phenomenal.
Right. Yeah.
I'm gonna
The
run-
opening presentation to it is one of the most famous Bitcoin speeches ever by a guy named Russ Stevens, who's the CEO of a
Russ.
company called NYDIG. And it's a whole explanation. Like it's this big New York firm now that that manages billions of dollars of assets, and essentially all of the principals of the company have invested personally significantly into Bitcoin, and explaining why they feel so passionate about it as a store of value asset, as a financial asset going into the future.
I'm gonna run, Tomer. Thanks so much
Yeah.
for letting me sit in. And,
Yeah, no, thanks for
you.
coming, and thanks
Great
for helping out.
explanation. Thanks for coming.
yeah, sure. And have a good one, guys. See you later.
See you. And I'll continue to take questions for the next few minutes if people have them, but otherwise we can also wrap up. Thank you all for attending.
Anyone else have questions?
Or just to backtrack on a question that was earlier regarding.
Oh, someone's asking a question, but they're really, really quiet.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
There you go.
Okay, just to backtrack on a question that was earlier about
yeah.
code changes within Bitcoin. Who initiates those code changes?
Oh, this is a really complicated topic because Bitcoin has no
I'm
central
technical,
command.
So
Yeah,
I'm
so
a bit
I
technical.
actually have to go, but I want to say thank you.
you're very welcome.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So the Bitcoin development process is open to anybody. Any coder can contribute. The main repository sits on GitHub in a repository called Bitcoin Core. People can submit pull requests, and people can respond to the pull requests and write them. The process of actually pushing through changes requires consensus. So even when there's new software, the Bitcoin software, unlike everything else that you see, does not prompt you and say, hey, there's a new update, you should download it, because part of the ethos is people should only download software that they want to download. So there's no software that's pushed on anybody. The same is true of merging code into the Bitcoin Core client. There's actually an upgrade right now that is going to add privacy and security features and also allow density in the blockchain. And everybody agrees it should go through, but how it should be implemented is a subject of significant discussion, whether it should default to true or whether people should write custom clients to make it true. You may not have been here at the beginning of this call, but when I was involved in Bitcoin, there was back in 2017, there was a big dispute about some kind of code change, and the core developers were very reluctant and ultimately did not make any of the changes to the code themselves. It took a rogue coder from outside to say, well, here's the change that the community wants. And the community is going to have to install it and run it, rather than the core developers themselves are going to push it on anybody's into the core client, because the ethos of decentralization is so important. If the developers could change the code, then they could change the rules, then things wouldn't work anymore. So at every layer of Bitcoin, from the developers to the community to the consensus algorithm to everything else, there's a very strong fight that everybody agrees on, right? Everybody agrees that they shouldn't have any control because it's dangerous to think for anybody to have control. And not, I shouldn't say everybody agrees. Occasionally you get the megalomaniacs who try to come in, and Bitcoin has a very strong immune system against that, because everybody else in the system calls that person out for trying to take control of the protocol. So it's a complicated process, and from the outside, it looks like, oh my God, these people don't agree at all. Like, look at them fighting over how to implement this feature that they all seem to want, but they can't agree on how to turn it on. This is all just part and parcel of the anti-fragility of Bitcoin. Everything within Bitcoin has to go through a ridiculous degree of scrutiny in order to ensure that the code is secure, because we're dealing with $1 trillion asset now, right? In order to ensure that there's no bugs in it, in order to ensure that nobody has attempted to take any control of it, in order to ensure that nobody is undermining its decentralization capability. So it's a really complicated answer. We're actually in the middle of something right now. Everybody agrees that this is a good thing. It's totally not controversial. The only controversy is how do we activate it so that we don't set any kind of precedent where somebody could activate code that would undermine Bitcoin at some point in the future.
So is it those core developers that make that decision?
No, they write the code, and they do not want to be in. Not one of them wants to say, "And I'm making the decision," right? So they've written the code, they've reviewed the code, they discuss the code, they discuss. The community says, "Here's what we want." But I think in this case as well, there seems to be some consensus around trying to put in something called a quick activate. But I think, again, the community is going to have to say, okay, we've modified the core client because it's open source to activate it at this point in time. And if enough of us run it and the miners mine it, these are the people who do the work, then it will activate at some period of time after everybody's signaled that they want it. And that's the way that it's going to go. So just to this is kind of a joke of an answer. So things like, how do you upgrade Bitcoin Core? Like, what's the process, or how do you do it? And say, very carefully, right? Like that's the answer. It's kind of like the question: how do you get to Carnegie Hall as you practice? How do you upgrade Bitcoin? Is very, very carefully. I would say. Yeah, very slowly. Bitcoin is not move fast and break things. Bitcoin is move slowly and do not break things. Be very, very cautious. Bitcoin Core, the main piece of software, I would argue, and I don't think it's a very hard case to make. I think it's the most secure piece of software in the world, and the most secure piece of software that's ever been written. It's completely open source. It's scrutinized by the most advanced cryptographers in the world. If it was vulnerable, there's $1 trillion prize for somebody who can hack it and destroy it. Nobody's managed to hack it or destroy it in all this time. I mean, Bitcoin's had zero downtime in the last 8 years. In the first couple of years, it had 2 very short downtime periods, each lasting under 9 hours. But the software has not been down for maintenance for even 1 second in the last 8 years. And the prize, and anyone can attack it from anywhere in the world, right? So this is just when we talk about the robustness of this thing and the security of it and the capability of it and the thinking that goes into it and the genius that goes into it, it really is just an unprecedented achievement. It's another one of those things that's unlike anything you've ever seen before, right? Like you all of us have worked at companies, I think, and you see how politics causes bad decision making because there's people with hierarchy and people with status and people with authority. Like, none of that exists in Bitcoin, right? Like, anybody, anywhere, even pseudonymously or anonymously, can submit software, can prove that there's a bug in some suggested code, can identify a bug and reveal it so that people can patch it. It's a completely non-hierarchical system of pure meritocracy and fueled by people who really deserve the merit. Like, that you've got all the best mathematicians and computer scientists who are focused on this, and now have a very vested interest in it, right? They hold Bitcoin. They've been involved in it for a number of years. Their life savings, their livelihood is invested in this thing not being corrupted. And they know that if they corrupt it, they'll destroy the value of Bitcoin. So there's a game theory thing here. It's like, even if you're a brilliant genius and you think you can corrupt Bitcoin, your incentive is to fix Bitcoin from that corruption rather than to actually corrupt it. Because if you corrupt it, it would become worthless and your fortune will be gone. So like, it's just when you start to study this and you see the phenomenons behind it, and how everybody eventually becomes aligned behind wanting this thing to succeed and not wanting to undermine it, you become more and more persuaded of the fact that this thing is going to take over the world.
Jim? So how how quickly, or what is your perspective of businesses actually setting themselves up to receive Bitcoin for payment? I know that real estate, our business is closely related to real estate.
Yeah.
And I'm beginning to see real estate transactions occur with
Mhm.
Bitcoin. So
Yeah.
can you just speak to what type
Yeah.
of businesses, all that type of
Sure.
things are starting to receive Bitcoin for payment?
Yeah. So I'll be really clear. My answer right now is going to be pure speculation, right? Like if you had asked me last March, is 2020 going to be the year that corporations start talking about transferring their balance sheet into Bitcoin? I would have said, oh, I don't think that happens until after, institution. Like I can be very wrong in my response here, right? Like why Tesla is accepting it versus other companies more quickly. It's because two people in Silicon Valley had a discussion about it and somebody persuaded Elon Musk that this is really, really, really important. And so it's hard to say exactly. So, okay, there's all my weasel words to explain why not. And I may not have very many good answers. In various jurisdictions, we're seeing more and more people accelerated into Bitcoin, right? So like in lots of parts of Africa, like in Nigeria, right? There's a real country there, but there's a terrible government there, and they've driven a lot of people into Bitcoin because they've made the rest of the legalized part of the economy, the legitimized part of the economy, very illegitimate. And so we start to see all sorts of people doing things there. We see various communities in the United States becoming much more interested in Bitcoin. There's, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the app that's called Clubhouse, which is kind of like this new social media app where people come on and they generate large rooms and speakers talk on it. There's a room that I've been to quite a number of times, and this isn't intended to single out one community, but it's to highlight the kind of communities out there. So there's a community that's called Black Bitcoin Billionaires, and it's a community principally targeting Black Americans. And the goal there is to get every month about 100,000 different Black families or Black-owned businesses to acquire 1 million Satoshis, which is 1/100th of a Bitcoin. And the idea there is that they can develop a circular economy detached from the banks, which generally are viewed as having discriminatory policies against that community, making it harder for them to do business with them than for other communities, and to create independence there. And so we're starting to see a community develop there. You mentioned real estate. There's definitely been interest up and down over the years of people buying and selling homes with Bitcoin. Maybe real estate, maybe foreign real estate is going to become something that becomes significant. We're in a very crazy point in time, right? Like I can't predict what's going to happen with predictable institutions in 3 months from now, let alone exactly how Bitcoin is going to play out in different areas. I don't think I think it's going to be the last place is it's not going to be very quickly something that people use to buy coffee every day, right? Or to fill up their gas tanks. But I could be wrong there because something like PayPal has now enabled Bitcoin to be bought by anybody and to be spent at any merchant. They'll convert to fiat if the merchant wants to receive fiat. And the CEO of Visa has said that they plan now on making Bitcoin available at all 70 million of their merchants worldwide. So it could be like, it could be like that. And you can spend Bitcoin anywhere and everywhere. You just send it to Visa to settle your bills. So this can all happen very quickly. That phenomenon at the end is a term that people call hyper-Bitcoinization. Say like when the world becomes Bitcoinized fully, that's hyper-Bitcoinization. And different speculators on this have different scenarios that they've envisioned as to how fast that might happen and what the catalysts for it would be. That is a fun term for you to Google if you're interested. Right? Just even Bitcoinization is an interesting term. All right. We may be wrapping up here. I'm still happy to take another question or two, but we've certainly gone over our time. I don't know if all of you have my email address. I'm going to give it all to you right now so that if you want to request access to the recording, just email me. It's I'll put it in here as well. It's tstrohlight. That's my first initial and my last name @gmail.com. That's my public one. Let me get it here again, tstrollite@gmail.com. I'll also share again here the link to my series of articles, which answers in a little bit more depth some of the questions that you guys were asking. Gives me a little bit of traffic here to some of my articles. And I know many of you know Mark here, so he knows where to get a hold of me on Telegram and other places. So if there's follow-up questions or other ways you want to connect.
Homer, thank you. This was outstanding. Once again,
glad you enjoyed it.
The recording will be valuable, I think, to a lot of people, and I know what you're doing. You could hopefully all picked up. He's very passionate about this, and it's always fun to have somebody that's as passionate as we are about it. So thanks again. And it's getting late there, so we'll let you go.
Okay, great.
Unless someone else has a last question.
Oh, thank you very much. Great job.
Okay, great.
Thank you,
You're
Tomer.
all very welcome. Wish you all the best.
Thank you, Tomer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.